Tonight, this is not a story about Kim.com. It's a story about something central to life in a Western democracy, that the people we entrust with great privileges, the right to act in secret, the right to spy on us, the right to share information about us, the right to carry guns and raid our homes, do so in ways the law intended. In this case, they didn't. The High Court has said that, and the Prime Minister has said that. And that's not a story about Kim.com. That's a story about New Zealand institutions who got it so wrong they even broke the law. The question is, why? What did happen at the Dotcom mansion 9 months ago now? Why did heavily armed police officers conduct a raid called illegal by the High Court, using warrants the court found to be invalid, following surveillance the Prime Minister himself has admitted was unlawful, to gather material the FBI removed from the country without consent? Illegal, invalid, unlawful. Why?
Here is Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry.
President Obama said he was going to Disney World for an official event.
The raid came at a time of intense pressure on the US president and his supporters from people who'd always been his friends, Hollywood. This is a Fox News story from the US.
The expensive buy comes as the top lobbyist for Hollywood exclusively told Fox his industry is threatening to cut off money to the president.
Don't make the false assumption this year that because we did it in years past, we're going to do it this year.
The MPAA's Chris Dodd. So Hollywood's mouthpiece was going absolutely ballistic. Stop the pirates, Mr. Obama and Congress, or you can forget about any more support from us. And Congress tried with a thing called SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Acts. Hollywood loved it. But, big but, the internet hated it, seeing it as anti-internet freedom. Protests were held, led by the might of Google and Wikipedia. But despite this, Hollywood kept pressing Congress.
This industry is watching very carefully who's going to stand up for them when their job is at stake.
It was an extraordinary outburst from a former Democratic senator and Obama ally, and there was plenty more where that came from.
We're talking about blocking the ability to steal American ideas and American products and American jobs from foreign sites. We do it.
Hollywood's hired gun wasn't going to give up, but he did, perhaps inadvertently, offer an alternative to the hated SOPA. Get the alleged pirates themselves, most of them foreigners.
The problem has been is that these thieves are now migrating offshore, locating themselves in places that are beyond the jurisdiction of U.S. courts.
And sure enough, 10,400 kilometres from Hollywood, in a flash house, flying a Finnish flag, driving a German car with his memorable name on it, was a man authorities simply couldn't help but notice.
Users 1 billion, per day 50 million. 4% of the internet.
In hindsight, the ad itself now almost seems an act of provocation against an establishment looking for a cautionary tale. Yes, Mega Upload touted its success in song, and always there at the microphone, you guessed it, Kim.com.
It's a hit! It's a hit!
All call signs,
Copy. The hit came on January 20th. The foreigners the MPAA had wanted so badly to take out were in Coatesville, New Zealand.
Ground units, gates are open.
And what made this perfect for the FBI was that unlike in Canada, where file-sharing sites abound, and according to one industry watchdog have operated with virtual impunity, or in China, where their government likes to sort things out themselves, New Zealand authorities would cooperate in a big way.
Located target, safe room, third level, over.
Confirm located target, safe room, third level.
Roger.
About 6 months ago, when we first started working on this story, I had an extraordinary, very off-the-record conversation with a Washington insider. Why us, I asked. Why did this all take place in New Zealand? They replied, and I quote, because you're easy. so eager to please. We can see evidence of that view of us in classified US documents about our government. In early 2010, briefing Hillary Clinton prior to her trip to New Zealand to meet with our Prime Minister, US officials describe PM Key with his strongly personal pro-American outlook and that of the National Party-led coalition government he heads. And they went on. PM John Key is openly excited about being invited by President Obama for a bilateral visit to Washington. And then a month later, when that invitation hadn't come, another cable obtained by WikiLeaks says nailing down a June visit is of intense importance to Key. He wanted to go, and eventually he got that invitation.
Hello, well next week we're heading off to the United States in what should be a very, very interesting visit. At the end of that week, I'll be at the Oval Office and meeting President Obama.
So that was the 13th of July and the PM set off for Washington. We'll return to that trip, but the date is important because just 5 days later, on the 18th of July, things suddenly started to go against Kim.com and his family, now well and truly living in New Zealand for the very first time. Prior to July, everything in New Zealand had gone strikingly smoothly for Dotcom, including, although no one told the PM, being granted residency. He applied for residency under the Investor Plus category, designed for people who want to invest at least $10 million in New Zealand. It hasn't been a great success. At that stage, Dotcom was one of only 10 people to come into the country under the scheme. Immigration Minister Jonathan Coleman knew of the application, but we're told he didn't tell his boss, John Key, that a man called Dotcom had entered New Zealand under the scheme and moved into the house at the top of this long drive, perhaps the country's most expensive home, right in the PM's own electorate. No one told John Key, no one at Immigration New Zealand, where it passed through a great many hands, even reaching the desk of the ministry's boss, Nigel Bickle, who clearly didn't tell the Prime Minister either. And then on the 29th of October 2010, 15 months before the Prime Minister would even hear of Dotcom, Immigration's Chris Biggs issued a special direction authorising the grant of residence to the applicant. Dotcom was in. His immigration consultant wrote back to the man at the very top, Nigel Bickle. I have spoken to Kim and passed on the good news. He is absolutely delighted. I expect his intended New Year's Eve fireworks party on the harbour will make the press. It certainly did. So, the fireworks were a thank you for residency. Kim.com welcoming Kim.com to New Zealand. Neither the PM nor anyone at the GCSB can have seen or heard anything about these residency explosions, because when the police told the GCSB Dotcom wasn't a New Zealand resident, they believed them and illegally spied on Dotcom, which is odd, because...
Just let me know when you're ready.
On the morning of the raid, when Detective Inspector Grant Wormald referred to those arrested, including Kim.com and Bram van der Kolk, he said,
2 of them currently have residency here in New Zealand.
The GCSB must have missed that too. Let's go back now to 2011. Remember, Dotcom had received residency approval, as almost everyone knew. He then set about buying the Coatesville mansion. Now, as New Zealand's most expensive home, he needed Overseas Investment Office consent to purchase it. And sure enough, the yeses continued. He got their formal consent on the 5th of April 2011. Formal consent then goes to the Beehive, and look at this. 2 days later, 7th of April, the Minister for Land Information, Maurice Williamson, signs off on it. So he too grants consent. 2 more ticks in the yes box for Kim.com. But then, completely out of the blue, and interestingly, 3 months after that formal approval had been given, on the 18th of July, Associate Finance Minister Simon Power suddenly declines consent. It was Dotcom's first no. And we believe that by that stage the FBI operation was not only well underway, New Zealand knew about it.
Within New Zealand, we have seized in excess of $6 million worth of top-end motor vehicles.
Detective Inspector Grant Wormold again on the day of the raid. The police have been somewhat vague about when the FBI first came to them for help.
This has been an investigation which I've personally been involved in since around about August last year with a team from the Organised Financial Crime Agency in New Zealand.
So Mr. Wormold, who ran things at an operational level, personally became involved round about August of last year, the 8th month of the year, round about. But almost exactly as Mr. Wormold was saying that, a police media release was being issued quoting Mr. Wormold as saying, the FBI contacted New Zealand police in early 2011 with a request to assist with their investigation into the mega conspiracy. Early 2011. So roughly a year before the raid that saw the 4 accused end up in the Auckland District Court charged with 21st century piracy. Who knew what in the year before that memorable day? We have to turn to the US for answers, as those involved in New Zealand simply refuse to say, but the prosecuting attorney's office is more helpful. Substantial and critical assistance was provided by the New Zealand Police, the Organised and Financial Crime Agency of New Zealand, Ofcans, that's Grant Wormold's group, the Crown Law Office of New Zealand and the Office of the Solicitor General for New Zealand. Now those last two loosely come under the control of our Attorney General, Chris Finlayson.
I call the Honourable Minister, Chris Finlayson.
I will choose my words very carefully because I believe that great care is needed in debating this issue because of
great care is Chris Finlayson's forte, as it should be in his job. He's highly respected. This is him in Parliament last week doing his best to defuse the Dotcom GCSB spy scandal.
But I emphasise that New Zealand is part of the wider international community, the lifeblood of which is the acceptance of international obligations, in particular those directed to the detection and suppression of international crime.
In July last year, Chris Finlayson was talking exactly those matters with other Attorney Generals in Australia. He's on the right. The man in the middle is the US Attorney General, Eric Holder. America's top law enforcement officer, he's the head of the Department of Justice, who led the case against Kim.com. It was a formal occasion to, quote, combat the growing threat of cybercrime. Its host, Australia's Attorney General, said, the global nature of cybercrime is such that no nation can fight the problem alone, making international cooperation and working closely with our allies a critical part of the response. Each Attorney General led discussions on a range of key national security and legal policy issues. New Zealand, who by then had received the request to assist with the Dotcom case, spoke about extradition. In the week that followed that meeting, Simon Power would overturn consent for Kim.com to buy the Coatesville mansion, and the Prime Minister would set off for his meeting with Barack Obama. We've already heard about that trip. It was a success, another step in the marked warming of New Zealand's relationship with America over recent years.
You know, I've got to be the luckiest Prime Minister of New Zealand in the last 25 years. I've come to Washington and every single person who we've met with from the administration has wanted to see us.
Including a meeting with the US Trade Representative, Ambassador Ron Kirk. Among his main interests, the TPP, that's us, intellectual property and fighting piracy, about which it was said, we thank Ambassador Ron Kirk and the interagency team who worked tirelessly to enhance the protection of US intellectual property rights overseas. The man who said that, Chris Dodd, the Hollywood lobbyist we met at the beginning of this story. Overseas includes New Zealand, of course. But the unprecedented joint operation between the FBI and New Zealand Police wasn't discussed, we're told. So if these two didn't discuss it, who did? Why didn't anyone raise anything with the PM? Not even once. Even here, in the Helensville electorate, where, as we revealed in May, the locals who wanted to discuss Kim.com with their MP, John Key, were referred elsewhere. He hadn't heard of Kim.com, who lived not far from here until the day before the raid. Which brings us back to where we started. What took place here on the 20th of January was unlawful, the surveillance before it illegal, and in the 12 months before the police raid, a whole lot of people knew who didn't tell the Prime Minister. Who signed off on it all? Why didn't they tell the PM? And when will someone answer those questions when the PM so obviously can't?
I'm not in a position to draw comment on that at this point, but I'm not in a position to actually comment about who those individuals are. I'm not in a position to comment on that. I'm not in a position to comment on that. I'm just not in a position to go into those details. I'm not in a position to comment about the individuals. I'm just not in a position to speculate that.
We asked the Prime Minister for an interview and he declined. Incidentally, Chris Dodd from the MPAA approached the Prime Minister at dinner in Los Angeles last week.